Before things hit the fan in September of 1939, Estonia had declared itself neutral, along with Latvia and Lithuania. Little did Estonia know, however, that Stalin and Hitler would assign it to the Soviet sphere of influence under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact about a year later. With the pact signed and Poland crushed, the Soviets set their sights on Estonia, leveraging the Orzel incident to justify an unjust ultimatum. With Soviet warships and warplanes looming overhead, Estonia signed an agreement stipulating that the Soviets could set up military bases in Estonia and call on it for military support. They should have never let Stalin get his foot in the door. In June 1940, some 160,000 Red Army troops spilt out of said bases or otherwise invaded Estonia. While some Estonians put up a fight, the government ordered the military to stand down. The Soviets then took control of the government and proclaimed Estonia as part of the USSR. Over the next year, they arrested, deported, and killed thousands of Estonians. Of the 8,000 arrested in this time, more than 1/4 of them were killed inside Estonia, while the rest were sent to prison camps in Russia, where they suffered a far slower death. In 1940, the Soviets conscripted some 17,000 Estonians into the Red Army under the 22nd Territorial Rifle Corps, but many of these men defected to the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, and the unit was liquidated in September 1941. Additionally, around 40% of Estonia's naval fleet, which was out of port during the Soviet invasion, sailed into the arms of the British, who enlisted Estonian ships and sailors in the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine. On Operation Barbarossa, it proved disastrous for Estonia. As the Soviets retreated, they employed scorched earth tactics, murdering thousands of civilians and destroying as many as 13,500 buildings and more than 3,200 farms. Of the 33,000 Estonians the Soviets had conscripted into the Red Army at this point, not even half of them saw combat, and those who didn't were discarded into concentration camps and labor battalions. Many brave Estonians fought against the Soviets too, with most of these men conducting guerrilla operations under the Baltic partisan organization known as the Forest Brothers, which we'll get to later. While most Estonians were happy to see the Soviets go, they soon realized the Germans weren't their friends. They set about Germanizing Estonia, letting Germans in and booting so-called undesirables out. They also subjected Estonia to the Holocaust, exterminating almost 1/4 of its Jewish population. While some Estonians volunteered to fight in the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, most didn't want to. It wasn't until 1944 that the Germans picked up their conscription game, consolidating various Estonian units under the 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, and bringing the number of Estonians fighting for Germany up to 70,000. This was in reaction to the turn of the tide of the Eastern Front. The Estonians and Germans staved off the Soviet counteroffensive for some time, but the Red Army ultimately retook Estonia, inspiring some 80,000 people to flee. The USSR literally dissolved before Estonia was in Estonian hands again, with the Russian Federation withdrawing from Estonia in 1994. Outside of Estonia, from 1942 to 1946, the Red Army also recruited ethnic Estonians into the USSR into the 8th Estonian Rifle Corps, which had grown to a strength of about 27,000 by late 1942. The Corps even fought against the aforementioned 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS at times, Estonians killing Estonians. All in all, Estonia lost around 25% of its 1.1 million strong population throughout the war. As we said earlier, Latvia started out neutral too. Also like Estonia, the Soviets forced Latvia into a pact which allowed the Red Army to station its troops on Latvian territory, beginning with some 25,000. Of course, once the Soviets had their foot in the door, they revealed their true intentions, demanding the entry of an unlimited number of troops. In June 1940, the Soviets marched in, took control of the government and annexed Latvia into the USSR. As with Estonia, they began Sovietizing it, arresting, deporting, and executing anyone who stood in their way. In 1940 alone, as many as 27,500 Latvians were arrested and as many as 50,000 lost their lives. Some 35,000 were deported, accounting for around 1.8% of the population. The Red Army also absorbed the Latvian army, ultimately turning it into the 24th Territorial Rifle Corps, though of the original 24,400 men in the corps, all but 3,000 either deserted or were arrested or shot. About a year after the Soviets had seized Latvia, the Germans drove them out and, like in Estonia, were welcomed with open arms. Again, Latvia's German liberators soon revealed their true nature, intending to Germanize Latvia by deporting or murdering up to 50% of its population, which was about 2 million at the time. Among the Latvians who were to be removed were the Jews, who accounted for around 70,000 of the 80,000 to 100,000 Latvian citizens killed under Nazi Germany's reign. What's worse is that some Latvians participated in the Holocaust, with the auxiliary police unit Aras Commando, for example, murdering as many as 26,000 Jews by itself. The Germans were much more successful at bringing Latvians into their army than their Soviet counterparts. Early in 1943, they started drafting them into the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, and by mid-1944, there were as many as 87,550 Latvians in the Latvian Legion of the SS and some 23,000 in Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Between 15 and 20% of them were volunteers. When the Soviets reversed the Eastern Front, they returned for Latvia as they did Estonia, occupying the state and subjecting its people to more arrests, deportations, and death. The Soviets also recreated Latvian Red Army units, mustering some 15,000 Latvians under the 130th Latvian Rifle Corps, which fought against Latvian SS units. Some 200,000 German troops held out in the region of Courland before surrendering to the Soviets, and among them were around 14,000 Latvian soldiers who joined the Germans in death or Soviet prison camps. Many of those who evaded the Soviets joined Latvian resistance movements, including the aforementioned Forest Brothers, and contested their occupation for decades. On resistance movements, various Latvian organizations resisted either the Soviets, Germans, or both during all three occupations. Some even worked with one foreign power to help defeat the other. The Latvian Central Council was an example of a pro-Latvian independence movement which fought for Latvia's interests alone, while many pro-Soviet resistance operated under the central staff of the partisan movement in Moscow. All in all, Latvia lost about 25% of its population throughout the war, and as with Estonia, the state wasn't back in Latvian hands until 1994. Unlike Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania was first assigned to Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, yet this was soon changed, and, as was customary, the Soviets coerced Lithuania into letting them accommodate some 20,000 troops there in October 1939. The Soviets then took control from the inside, let in more troops, and colored Lithuania red on the map. During this first occupation, Lithuanian partisans such as the Lithuanian Activist Front were active, but Lithuanians were still forced to fight in the Red Army, namely under the 16th and 29th Rifle Divisions. Many of these men deserted as soon as they could, though some Lithuanian communists chose to stay on and fight the Germans alongside other Lithuanians from elsewhere in the USSR. During Sovietization, between 20,000 and 30,000 Lithuanians were deported, many to labor camps in Central Asia. Around 12,000 were arrested as enemies of the people, and a further 17,000 were deported to Siberia in the lead up to the German invasion. As for the German invasion itself, it was met by some joint Soviet and Lithuanian resistance, while some anti-Soviet and pro-independence resistance movements worked to undermine the Soviets from the inside. Still, after taking some 3,400 casualties, the Germans successfully took and occupied the state. Having killed thousands of Lithuanians in the process, however, Lithuania wasn't quite so welcoming as the other two Baltic states. Unlike with Estonia and Latvia, no Lithuanian Waffen-SS unit was formed, and their resistance was generally more organized. Still, Lithuania took the full brunt of German occupation, with the Holocaust beginning within the first few days and as many as 120,000 Lithuanian Jews losing their lives by December 1941 alone. By the end of the war, that number grew as large as 195,000, accounting for 90 to 95% of the state's Jewish population. Tens of thousands of Lithuanians took part in the Lithuanian Holocaust or otherwise assisted their occupiers. Also, by June 1944, as many as 100,000 Lithuanians had been deported to Germany, where they undertook forced labor. Coordinated in part by the Lithuania partisan movement, Lithuanians, Poles, and even Soviets contested the Germans, but the Lithuanian partisans largely avoided violence at this time. When the Soviets returned, they actively contested resistance organizations by deporting as many as 120,000 people by 1953. This didn't wholly undo the Lithuanian resistance, however. The aforementioned Forest Brothers continued to engage their occupiers until 1953, while non-violent resistance continued for decades beyond that. If the partisans were caught, they were tortured to death and their entire families may have been deported. Often, they exploded themselves with grenades to avoid capture. On the Forest Brothers in general, at least 50,000 Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians lost their lives fighting foreign occupation throughout World War II, and up until they regained their independence in the early 1990s. Fun fact, Forest brother Jānis Pyrrhus didn't come out of hiding until 1995. All in all, Lithuania lost over 1 million people between 1940 and 1953, which works out to be about a third of the state's pre-war population. So we've tried to cover a lot of ground in relatively little space here, but what do you think? Did we do the Baltics justice? Of the many topics we brushed over in this video, which would you like to see us cover in more detail? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before I'm abandoned by you, make sure you check out some of the links in the description below, including our Patreon if you want access to a behind the scenes Discord server where you can chat to myself and the entire team and get access to exclusive videos, or our socials where you can get access to exclusive content you won't find on this channel. These include our Discord, Instagram, and Facebook. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.
This episode is brought to you by Magellan TV. We've really been enjoying our Magellan TV subscription, and we hope you have too. We're excited to announce that Magellan is now offering a buy one get one free gift card for the people in your life you want to give the gift of knowledge to. If you go to our page in the description, there will be a banner to take advantage of this limited offer for our YouTube viewers. Purchasing a gift card any time of the year will also give you an additional month of Magellan TV for free, even if you're already a member. So now is the time to try it and share it with your friends and family if you haven't already. If you're already a member, here's our documentary recommendation: Operation Foxley, Mission, Liquidate Hitler. Using declassified documents, you can learn about how the SOE planned to assassinate Hitler. You can see the specialized weapons and gadgets, the strategy and the ideal locations to carry out such a mission, and why in the end the plan ultimately failed. For those that haven't subscribed yet, Magellan TV is a documentary streaming membership service founded by filmmakers, bringing you premium content and diving deep into the subjects you want to learn more about. Magellan TV has the richest and most varied content on history available anywhere. Magellan TV has over 3,000 plus documentary movies, series, and exclusive playlists, many available in 4K. They have ancient, modern, current, early modern, war and biographical history, science, space, and even true crime, which can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop, or mobile device. All the shows are without interruptions from commercials. We've got a special offer where you can check it out all for free. Simple History viewers get a 1-month free trial membership. Just go to try.magellantv.com/simplehistory or click the link in the description below and you can check out our documentary recommendation, Operation Foxley, Mission Liquidate Hitler, for free. The Werewolf Holdouts, Last-Ditch Nazi Resistance, World War II. In 1944, there was a widespread realization among the Nazi leadership that they could actually lose the war. Then on June 6th of that year, their worst fears came true when the Allies successfully landed a massive invasion force at Normandy in northern France and threatened to retake occupied Europe. The Nazi leadership quickly started to fall apart after that point, and there was even a serious attempt on July 20th, 1944 to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at his Wolf Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler and his senior officials were looking for a last resort to keep Nazi ideology alive and turned to the supernatural for inspiration. The Germans proceeded to put a contingency plan into place, codenamed Operation Werewolf. The idea was to create a covert resistance force to continue the Nazi struggle as the Allies advanced through Germany. The strategy was not so much to win the war by guerrilla fighting, but to hold out long enough for a political settlement more favorable to Germany. Werewolves and wolves were used as symbols of German strength against those seeking to destroy them. The movement was designed to be decentralized and was mainly overseen by regional security officials. This was partly a reaction to the military bombardment under which Germany found itself. Decentralization would allow groups to operate independently should any part of the network fail. Towards the end of that year, Heinrich Himmler, who was head of the feared Waffen-SS, had recruited one of his most senior officers, a Nazi fanatic called Hans Adolf Preutzmann, to set up, train, and coordinate the new werewolf units. These elite groups of volunteers were to be trained in guerrilla warfare tactics, sniping, sabotage, assassination, and fashioning improvised explosives. They were ordered to sabotage, commit acts of terrorism, suppress German collaboration, and generally make life as difficult as possible for the occupying Allies. They were supposed to be provided with the latest specialized equipment like suppressed pistols, fireproof coats, and high-tech sniper rifles to carry out these missions. But the werewolf units never saw their full realization, as Nazi Germany fell into total disarray from the constant Allied aerial bombing. This had caused severe equipment shortages, as Germany's industrial base was almost completely destroyed. By the end of 1944, Preutzmann had only gathered about 5,000 fighters. Nevertheless, by early 1945, several hundred recruits had been trained at the werewolf's chief training camp at the medieval Hohlkrath Castle near Erkelenz in Germany. Most of these recruits were drawn from the Hitler Youth. One of the few wartime missions carried out by members of the werewolf organization was Operation Carnival on March 20, 1945. During this mission, a werewolf unit parachuted into a Belgian forest on the Dutch-Belgian border outside of the German city of Aachen, using a captured Luftwaffe-operated U.S. Army B-17 Flying Fortress bomber. Their target for assassination was the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, who the Nazis considered to be a traitor. They used intelligence to discover Oppenhoff's whereabouts and successfully assassinated him on March 25, 1945. In fact, he was killed by an SS unit which was composed of werewolf trainees from Hohlkrath Castle. One of the six-person team was Isa Hirsch, who was a League of German Maidens girl and a captain. She was chosen because she would arouse less suspicion as Allied patrols were looking for military-aged men wandering around. The werewolf unit pretended to be German pilots who were looking for the front lines. As Oppenhoff persuaded them to surrender, they shouted "Heil Hitler" and shot Oppenhoff in the head. One of the assassins was killed, and Hirsch was injured afterwards when they triggered a landmine while fleeing through a nearby forest. The landmine was likely placed by the German army. The rest of the werewolf unit escaped into the countryside. A small group of SS werewolf staff were able to make their way into the Alps after the surrender, where they joined forces with a few soldiers and attempted to make a last stand. The makeshift unit was beset with problems, bad weather, breakdowns, and unsurprisingly, desertions, and was finally defeated by US forces. Much was made of the propaganda value of these so-called werewolf units, with German newspapers running sensational and mostly fictitious headlines such as "Fury of Nazi werewolves to be unleashed on invaders." Lieutenant Otto Skorzeny, a commando specialist and holder of the Knight's Cross, was later brought in to oversee training and further development of the werewolf units. Jürgen Stroop, famous for crushing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, was also asked to consult. They were stunned to find out that the number of werewolf cells had been greatly exaggerated, and those few units in existence were highly disorganized. Even the secret supply dumps buried around the country were not properly recorded, so few of the units knew where any of them actually were. The explosives, ammunition, and weapons had been buried in 1939, but by 1945 no one knew their location, and the advancing Soviets discovered most of them. Skorzeny then turned the efforts of Operation Werewolf towards establishing a Nazi underground railroad, which allowed thousands of SS officers to travel along escape routes called rat lines and flee. On March 23, 1945, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, gave a speech known as the Werewolf Speech, in which he said it was every German's duty to fight to the death. Then on April 1st, Radio Werewolf started broadcasting from a small town in eastern Germany, and its message was simple: resist the Allied invaders by whatever means possible. It began each program with a howling wolf sound and a song with the words, "My werewolf teeth bite the enemy." The radio station was on the air for only a matter of weeks, but it enthusiastically claimed several high-ranking Allied officers had been successfully assassinated by werewolf units, including Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, and British Major John Poston, liaison officer of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. In fact, both of these deaths were actually due to being in combat against German regular army units. In early April 1945, Goebbels' top aide, a Nazi called Werner Naumann, sent out a long and rambling message to the heads of all major propaganda offices across Germany. He called on them to encourage the German people to prepare and continue fighting beyond the end of the war. All of this created the illusion of an organized and dedicated Nazi secret resistance, so much so that the Allies took their threat seriously. Operation Werewolf was highly effective in its psychological impact that it had on the Allies and on German civilians. Hitler had committed suicide by shooting himself on April 30th, 1945, in his Führer bunker in Berlin. But for a while, every act of sabotage, mysterious accident, or misfortune that befell the Allied occupiers in Germany after the war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, was credited to the werewolves. For a long time, Allied commanders had been concerned that they would face a wide-scale German insurgency and were terrified they were going to become embroiled in a partisan war that could drag out for years. Rumors concerning Operation Werewolf played directly into this fear. Allied propaganda meant that for the first few months of the occupation, there was a strict policy of non-fraternization with German citizens. Resistors were often shot or hanged, and it was believed that any German showing their right ear in an ID card photo was a secret wolf. Even local groups who offered to assist in the hunt for Nazis were not above suspicion. Strict regulations were placed on the German population, curfews were established, and it was made illegal to own firearms. By some estimates, between 3,000 to 5,000 German civilians and soldiers lost their lives in Allied reprisals out of fear of werewolf units. This fear eventually subsided, as the werewolf threat seemed to simply fade away, as the danger of the Nazis continuing an armed struggle never really materialized. Ultimately, the werewolf's propaganda value ended up far outweighing its actual achievements. In fact, the damage done was mostly to the German citizenry, since historians estimate that several thousand deaths resulted from the werewolf campaigns because they targeted all those who welcomed the Allies. A few other groups of werewolves were able to hold out until 1947, but for the most part they were limited to slogan painting and acts of sabotage. After the war, the Allies carried out a highly successful policy of denazification, which was designed to eradicate all the symbols, political organizations, and figureheads that had been created to support the Nazi culture from German society. Then the new rising danger was the Soviet Union and its allies. Rather than continue to fight against the occupying forces of Great Britain, the United States, and France, the German people were more concerned in dealing with this new impending threat. So soon, the West German countryside would be full of large packs of leopards with roaming lynxes flying overhead and cobras hiding in every hedgerow in an attempt to deter any attack by the Soviet Union.
After suffering casualties, Antiochus's archers started retreating behind the main line, and as the Roman skirmishers moved forward, it became dangerous to keep the elephants close to the front, as they tended to become frenzied under fire. The Seleucid center then closed its ranks. With no light footmen to defend the line, the Seleucid heir ordered his chariots to counterattack. A scythed chariot was a fearsome weapon against tight groups. but the Roman skirmishers were in a loose formation, so when the chariots charged, they were able to disperse and allow the enemy through. The skirmishers then turned and started sending volleys into the charioteers, while Eumenes then sent his light cavalry to attack them. Many horses and riders were killed, and the rest panicked and turned back to find refuge behind their lines. At this point, the Arab camel archers were sent forward to assist the charioteers, as the Seleucid officers knew that the camel scent might scare the Roman horses and save the chariot corps. This backfired spectacularly, as the chariot riders were not able to control their horses anymore and basically smashed into their own camel riders. The details are scarce, but the Seleucid left lost all cohesion and soon was attacked by the full force of the King of Pergamon. The light cavalry and the infantry weren't able to withstand this charge, and even though the Hetairoi and cataphracts were much more disciplined, they were more used to fighting as an attacking force. Slowly but surely they were first pushed back and then broken. Things were completely different on the Seleucid right, owing to the fact that the width of the battlefield was 5 kilometers, which prohibited information from reaching the flanks in time. Seeing his missile infantry on the back foot, the Seleucid king allows them to pass, and then counterattacked with his heavy and light cavalry. This charge quickly scattered the enemy in front of them. The cavalry then got into a single line on the go, and that seemingly shocked the Roman left, who were marching forward behind their velites and now were in a wider place on the battlefield. Ahenobarbus attempted to widen his front by sending his small cavalry contingent to defend the flank. This wasn't enough. The Roman horsemen were crushed, and the side of the legionary formation was now open to further attacks. Apparently the Seleucids destroyed the enemy formation here and started chasing them towards the camp. Hundreds died in this chase, but eventually they reached the camp. Here Lepidus attempted to form a line, but the panic was too strong and his troops were ordered to kill the retreating legionnaires. The harsh treatment finally stopped those attempting to run. Buoyed by the Macedonian pikes, the Roman line was able to put some distance between them and Antiochus. The king's light cavalry was supposed to attack from behind, but got too distracted by the riches of the camp, which gave the Romans enough leeway to put their back against the walls of the camp. Antiochus hadn't received any news from his army for some time, and wasn't eager to attack the pikes, so he ordered his warriors to break off and return. Meanwhile, the Roman centre pushed forward, and the remainder of the Seleucid right, seeing that their centre would be surrounded, attempted to join them in defence. Indeed, soon the centre of Antiochus' force was encircled. For some time the Romans tried to use their missiles to weaken the phalanx, but it wasn't too effective. Eumenes and Scipio knew that the Seleucid leader would eventually return, so they ordered a unit of cavalry to block him and commanded their heavy infantry to close in. The Phalangites formed a pike wall and attempted to retreat towards their own camp, but it was difficult while they were attacked from all sides. Antiochus's cavalry easily broke the unit sent to block them, but by the time they arrived, the phalanx was finally broken and its desperate members were chased and killed by the Roman cavalry. Some units were able to retreat from the battlefield, but it seems that the majority of the Seleucid army was either killed or captured. We don't have a good source for the Roman casualties, however it can be concluded that they were in the thousands. Antiochus's decision to place himself on the right, which was the place of honor, was the biggest mistake he made, as it precluded him from personally stabilizing the situation on his left. In the aftermath of the battle, Antiochus started retreating towards Epimea, while the Romans took Sardis. The king wanted to continue fighting, as his empire was vast and rich enough to field another army, but even the mightiest kings should consider the opinion of their subjects after 2 decisive defeats, and both the courtiers and commoners wanted peace. So in early 189 BC, Antiochus sent envoys to discuss the terms. The Roman demands were steep, but the Seleucids agreed without much discussion. The defeated empire had to withdraw from lands to the west and north of the Taurus Mountains and pay 15,000 talents as war indemnity. The king also gave away all of his elephants with a promise not to procure more in the future. The Seleucids were only allowed to keep a navy of 10 ships and not to sail beyond Kallichadnus. The Romans took 20 hostages, including the son of the king, another Antiochus. The peace would not be signed until the next year, as it had to be ratified by the Roman Senate, but in the end, the Seleucid lands in Europe were given to the Thracian kingdom, while the territories in Asia were divided between Rhodes and Pergamon. This weakened the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus was killed by a mob in Babylon in 187, while Armenia, Atropatene and Parthia, who were already somewhat autonomous, rebelled and became independent. The Seleucid dynasty would rule for another 120 years, but their realm would continuously shrink. In 189, Rome sent 2 new consuls to Greece and Asia Minor to finish the wars. The first, Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, not only made sure that the Seleucids fulfilled the terms of the treaty, but also went to war with Galatia. The Galatian War, that the Romans won handily, is beyond the scope of this video, but it was remarkable for 2 reasons. It showed that Rome could now easily invade Asia Minor, and was the first time a Roman general declared war without the approval of the Senate, and this set a precedent that would lead to the downfall of the Republic. While all that was happening in the east, the ceasefire between Rome and Aetolia ended in early 189, and using the absence of the Roman armies, the Aetolians attacked Philip of Macedon and easily pushed him out of Thessaly. However, soon the second consul, Marcus Fulvius Nobilior, arrived. Supported by the Epirotes, he besieged Ambracia, and that forced the Aetolian army to retreat from Macedon, as they were worried about being outflanked. Although Ambracia managed to resist for months, it was clear to the League that it wouldn't be able to fight on without the Seleucids, so using Athenian mediation, they started peace negotiations with Rome. Again, the demands were heavy, but the Aetolians had no other choice but to accept. The League lost half of its members and territory, and also was prohibited from having a foreign policy without Rome's approval. Although technically independent, the League stopped being a major player after this treaty. After Cynocephaly, the second son of Philip V, Demetrius, became a hostage of the Romans, and he had emerged from that experience a committed Romanophile. Supported by the Roman Senate, he returns to Macedon with a very different attitude. The royal court in Pella had become bitterly divided over the Roman issue. One of these circles was led by Demetrius and consisted of nobles who favoured peace with Rome. Another group formed around the duo of Philip V and his eldest son Perseus, and was packed with firebrands who advocated resistance against the invaders. Both factions began an underhanded war of propaganda. Perseus's mother was routinely slandered as being a low-birth concubine, implying that Perseus was less legitimate than Demetrius. The latter made a mistake at this point, confiding to a courtier named Didas that he planned to flee to Rome. This man promptly told Philip, who also discovered a letter speaking of Demetrius's lust for the throne. Despite it probably being a forgery, Didas poisoned Demetrius in the winter of 181 BC on the order of Philip. The outcome was a surge in hostility between Rome and Macedon. The situation destabilized even further in 179 BC, when after over 4 decades of rule, Philip V passed away in Amphipolis while preparing for a campaign against the Thracians. With his rival Demetrius also dead, Perseus became the king of Macedon. He did what new Antigonid kings always had to, immediately reaffirming old friendships and building new ones. Rivals to the throne were eliminated, and in this new Rome-dominated world, it was necessary to send emissaries to the Senate, hoping for their official recognition of Perseus's accession to the throne. Reluctantly, this was granted. On the diplomatic front, Perseus also entered into many alliances and diplomatic arrangements with the various city-states. Naturally, this was to the great annoyance of the Romans. Furthermore, to the east, Perseus astutely married his sister to Prusias II of Bithynia, and the king himself married the daughter of Seleucid monarch Seleucus IV. So in addition to playing nice with the Greeks in the city-states, Perseus was also swiftly gaining a network of useful Hellenic allies in Asia Minor, much to the increasing anger of Pergamon, which was excluded from these affairs. Its king, Eumenes II, played his kingdom's usual part as an informant to the Romans. Initial insistences and warnings by Eumenes to the Roman Senate fell on receptive ears. In 175 and 174 BC, repeated Roman warnings to Perseus refused to cow the young king. Moreover, he performed a grand spectacle of marching his entire army on a peaceful parade through Delphi, the sacred center of the Greek world. The message was clear: he was the protector of the Greeks, not the Romans. Increasingly urgent embassies from Pergamon began to beseech the Roman Senate for help, and in early 172 BC, Eumenes himself came to plead his case. He claimed that the peace had allowed Macedon to fully recover its strength. Finally, the Pergamese king played his trump card, stating to the Romans that, "I felt it would be utterly disgraceful if I failed to reach Italy to warn you before he arrived here with his army." Cynically playing on the post-Hannibalic fear of invasions, Eumenes got his way. The subsequent diplomatic pressure and investigations into Perseus's conduct would turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the king would see the Senate was intent on destroying him. Philip V may have been the aggressor in the previous war, but now the Romans were hungry for conflict with Perseus. Roman envoys sent to negotiate a truce with the Macedonian king then boasted of deceiving him into thinking there was even a chance of peace. In fact, the truce was purely a measure in order to gain more time for the Romans to prepare for war, as they refitted a fleet of old ships and embarked a powerful army from Brundisium to Apollonia. This Roman new cunning of deception and underhanded tactics was not met with approval from all quarters. More traditionalist senators remembered a time when the Romans treated their enemies as honored and honorable men. It turned out that such methods were no way to run an empire. Whatever the case, the Roman Senate had decided that the only way to maintain their position in Greece was to have no equals at all. The Antigonid monarchy had to disappear, and the Third Macedonian War began. Roman consul Publius Licinius Crassus crossed the Adriatic in the late summer of 171 BC in order to take control of the legions there. At the same time, Eumenes of Pergamon arrived at Chalcis with his fleet, disembarking with 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry of his own. The Romans had unquestioned mastery of the Aegean Sea, so they dismissed the allied vessels, only retaining Eumenes' assistance. Meanwhile, Perseus advanced south into Thessaly, ravaging lands on the way, and encamped just to the south of Mount Ossa, having taken command of the army his father had begun to rebuild. At the same time, Licinius secured the Greek west coast and advanced into Thessaly via Apamania. When the consul arrived at the Greek city of Larissa, he encamped just outside the town by a hill, where he was reinforced by Eumenes' Pergamene forces. As the Macedonians had grown bolder due to their unopposed ravaging of the Thessalian countryside, Perseus decided to march toward the Roman camp, erecting their own around 5 miles away. After resting his army for the night, Perseus drew up his line into formation and marched his cavalry as well as the light infantry forwards. The phalangists stayed in reserve. Odrysian king Cotys IV commanded the Thracian cavalry and interspersed light infantry on the left flank, while Macedonian horsemen and Cretan skirmishers on the right were led by Medon of Beroea. Both wings were flanked by the king's cavalry and auxiliary infantry from various foreign nations, while the centre was made up of Perseus's elite agema, the sacred cavalry, and 400 slingers in front. Opposite the Macedonians, Licinius's field army formed up its heavy infantry safely behind their camp's ramparts, sending their own cavalry and skirmishers out to meet the enemy. The Roman right wing, commanded by Caius Licinius Crassus, consisted of the Italian equites, with velites scattered between them, while on the left, Valerius Lavinus commanded the Greek allied cavalry and infantry. In the centre, Quintus Mucius led a force of Gauls, Thessalians, and other volunteer cavalry. Missile fire from javelins and slingstones opened the battle, causing light casualties on both sides, before Cotys' Thracian horsemen charged. They fought like wild beasts, according to Livy, and smashed through the Roman right-wing cavalry. At the same time, Perseus and his elite agema troops broke the Roman centre. Believing he could turn the battle into a decisive engagement, Perseus was about to order his phalanx into battle, but was persuaded not to take such a risk by Euander the Cretan. Thanking Euander for his wise counsel and taking the victory where he could, Perseus withdrew back to his camp. 200 Roman cavalry and 2,000 infantry had died, and only 60 of Perseus's men had died. Further skirmishes followed this battle, but the campaigning season of 171 BC was essentially over. The Romans proceeded to raze the anti-Roman cities in Boeotia. Haliartus was completely annihilated after a short siege, 2,500 men were sold into slavery, and the town remained desolate for decades afterwards. This type of increasingly notorious Roman savagery in Greece, along with Perseus's victory at Callinicus, made the Macedonian king appear to be the champion of the Greeks. Most who believed this were still too frightened of Rome to take action, but the Molossians of Epirus did defect. One setback after another appeared to be striking the Romans in this conflict, and this was only compounded when Perseus launched a successful raid on the Roman fleet at Aureus, destroying ships and spoiling grain supplies. However, Perseus knew that he needed a decisive victory in battle. By the end of 169, Rome's position in Greece appeared precarious, and only the arrival of the new consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, in 168 BC, breathed fresh life into the floundering Roman cause in Greece. The force which Aemilius took command of was large. 2 especially strengthened Roman and allied legions, recruited from the Etruscans and Samnites, totaled around 22,000 legionary heavy infantry. Supporting the heavy troops were thousands more light infantry, including velites and men from Pergamon and the city-state allies. 4,000 cavalry also mounted up in the Roman army, including 1,000 of the infamous Numidian cavalry under their prince Misigenes. With the North African troops also came 22 imposing war elephants. Perseus, meanwhile, had around 44,000 foot and 4,000 horse. 21,000 of the infantry comprised the fearsome phalangists with their sarissa pikes and phalanx formation, which reached a mile in length. Supporting this moving wall of pikes were light troops, auxiliaries such as the Thracian javelinmen and Illyrian archers. After advancing into Thessaly in the summer of 168, Aemilius marched south, meeting Perseus at the foot of Mount Olympus, where he had drawn up his army in a highly defensible position. The Antigonids were dug in on the west bank of the Elpius River, just east of the mountain, and had easy access to the nearby town of Dium. With typical Roman grit, it seems like the fact that Perseus had such a good position did not bother the legionaries, and, eager to redeem their honour after Callinicus, urged Emilius to attack immediately. As a retort, Emilius told his men to mind their place, and underlined the fact that they would fight when and how he told them to. In order to dislodge Perseus from his defensive position, Emilius assigned a subordinate, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, to launch a feint towards the sea with 3,500 allied infantry and 5,000 legionaries. Under the cover of darkness, he would march through an unguarded pass in order to surprise Perseus. This might have gotten the jump on Macedon's king, but a Cretan auxiliary in the Roman army defected and informed his fellow Greeks of the Roman plan. Reacting immediately to this alarming news, Perseus sent a general named Milo with 2,000 Macedonians and 10,000 Thracian mercenaries to oppose the Roman passage. Though Nasica hadn't expected this resistance, upon his arrival in the pass he ordered a charge. The mountain fighting in narrow defiles and passages was bloody and brutal, and Nasica himself supposedly came toe-to-toe with a fearsome Thracian soldier, slaying him with a pilum javelin. Rome's legionaries doggedly stabbed and slashed their way through the mountain pass, routing the Macedonians, who then fled back to the main army and informed Perseus of the defeat. Realizing that the loss of this mountain would render his position vulnerable, the king immediately decamped and marched away from the mountain. While Emilius moved through the mountain pass and emerged onto the foothills around Mount Olocrus, Perseus drew up his army behind a river on the plain below, near the town of Pydna. The hand-picked field of battle was fantastic for the Macedonian phalanx, and Perseus's position atop a small ridge and behind the river gave him a distinct advantage. Emilius knew this, and so did not advance just yet, remaining in his camp on the hills. The general's officers, especially Nasica, quickly became restless and wanted to attack immediately. Stoically, Emilius smiled and advised Nasica not to be so hasty, informing him of the folly of attacking a phalanx on such ground. The Romans did not waste their time, and constructed a marching camp for that night. When darkness had fallen and the soldiers were resting around the various campfires and sleeping in their tents, the moon suddenly grew dark, its white colour shifting to a dull red. The superstitious men in the Macedonian camp were deeply affected and surprised by what was apparently a bad omen. A moon which seemed to bleed red. Had Zeus abandoned them? At the same time, the equally pious Romans did not react as badly. Why was this? A military tribune of the Roman army, Caius Sulpicius Gallus, was a learned astronomer. The day before, he approached his general and gained his permission to assemble the soldiers, informing them that such an event, that we know as a solar eclipse, would occur on the following night. He urged the soldiers not to see such a thing as an ill omen, as it was a regular, predictable and natural thing. Therefore, when the eclipse did occur, the Roman soldiers simply followed their commander in offering sacrifices to the Greek gods, promising to hold games in Heracles' honor. The gestures worked, and the Roman soldiers' morale was unaffected. With both leaders engaging one another in a dangerous staring contest, it would take a spark for the flames to ignite. Said spark came in the form of a misbehaving mule. In order to fill up jugs of water for the thirsty Roman soldiers who wore heavy armor, a small train of mules was led down to a stream below the foothills by lighter troops. Like the stubborn creatures they are, one of the parched pack animals supposedly scented the water and bolted away from its handlers. The water gatherers ran after it and discovered that a group of Perseus's Thracian troops were doing the same. Moreover, the enemy was attempting to steal their mule. The irritated, frustrated and scorching Roman soldiers were not going to give up that mule, and a brawl broke out over the animal. Runners on both sides went to get help, while the mule probably just ran off. Perseus saw an opportunity to draw the Romans down from the uneven foothills of Mount Olocrus, and marched his entire army out of the camp and straight towards the brawl at the stream. The Romans could see what was going on from their camp, and they were furious, demanding angrily to be allowed to march out and fight. Emilius risked mutiny if he refused, and so gave the signal to form up. After only allowing his legions a brief amount of time to form up, he swiftly commanded the advance, aiming to save the men at the stream. At that moment, the marching phalangists were given the order to lower their pikes. In unison, the first 5 ranks held their sarissæ horizontally, and the ranks behind them kept them at a 45-degree angle. Then they advanced. Against the barely armoured Roman light troops, whose main job was to skirmish at a distance, the phalangists met almost no serious resistance and simply tore through the enemy ranks. Valiantly trying to buy the Romans more time, an auxiliary tribal leader named Salvius obtained his unit's standard and threw it into the phalanx. This galvanized the pressured soldiers, and they furiously tried to get it back. This resulted in massive casualties, but slowed the advance of the phalanx and allowed some men to escape. Emilius' main force was now closing in, and the swarm of velites and other skirmishers threw their missiles at the phalanx, mostly to no effect. The legionary heavy infantry, having witnessed the slaughter of their more lightly armoured comrades, became frightened and began to slow down. They saw the sheer size of the steamroller that approached them, and their morale started to wane. Emilius had to act right now, otherwise his short-sword-armed men were going to be slaughtered on the flat ground. So, the general ordered an immediate withdrawal and ceded the plains to Perseus, moving for the foothills once again. Owing to the phenomenal discipline of the Roman legions, the retreat was carried out successfully, and Emilius now had some breathing room to attack. Wheeling his horse to the right flank, he ordered the wing of 34 elephants to charge forward, with a mass of cavalry behind them. The Thracian and mercenary skirmishers immediately in the path of this charge were ideal troops for dealing with elephants, but they were exhausted and failed to concentrate enough missiles. The elephant vanguard caught them on a bad day, and they carved a bloody hole into Perseus's left wing. The cavalry then streamed around the elephants and mopped up those that were left, leaving the agama on the leftmost edge of the phalanx completely exposed. The victorious Roman right wing chased the retreating skirmishers, and then slowly began to reform slightly behind Perseus's line. Throughout this battle on the edge of the field, the phalanx had been pursuing the withdrawing legions into the foothills and onto rough ground. With the infantry screen already gone, the rightmost legionary unit swung inward and drove into the phalanx's vulnerable left. At the same time, gaps gradually began to open in the phalanx due to the increasingly uneven terrain. Emilius took full advantage of this, riding up and down the line, shouting at his men to attack. Whether or not he was heard, the Roman centurions knew what they were doing and led their men into the now exposed arteries of the Macedonian phalanx. The pressure now began to mount. Fighting in unfavourable close-quarters combat and hit on the flank, the phalanx began to slowly fragment. Emilius, who had retreated to a position of command on the heights, saw small streams of Antigonid troops fleeing from the rear of the infantry block. The coup de grace was delivered by the now regrouped Roman right flank. The elephants and cavalry now charged at the disintegrating army of Perseus and utterly routed it. Last of all were the 3,000 elite agama of Perseus. Not a single one of these valiant men fled, and they fought to the last man while their king fled on his horse. One of the greatest phalanxes ever had been crushed, and Alexander the Great's military legacy was finally buried. The legion would rule the field of battle from this point on. 20,000 of Perseus' troops were killed, and 11,000 more were captured, including Perseus himself. Emilius was given the title of Macedonicus by the Senate. The victorious general was voted a triumph and rode through Rome on his chariot. The treasures of Macedon and his victorious troops marched behind him. Macedon proved to be too dangerous for Rome to allow it to remain independent, so in the aftermath of the war, the Antigonid monarchy was dissolved into 4 semi-states or meredies, each with a capital and elected officials, but subject to the laws imposed by the Romans. The regions were allowed to keep small garrisons along the borders with outside tribes, but not allowed to have an independent foreign policy or engage in trade between them and intermarry. Their economy was further weakened by an excessive tribute paid to Rome, as well as a ban on gold and silver mining, logging and shipbuilding. On top of that, the Romans enacted revenge on the Molossians who supported Perseus. 70 of their cities were destroyed, and 150,000 Epirotes were enslaved. All this caused resentment and impoverishment, which made the populace anti-Roman. Soon those who would use this appeared on the horizon. A youth called Andriscos, born in Adramyttium in Asia Minor, had an uncanny resemblance to the late Macedonian king Perseus, and in 150 BC, he started telling everyone who would listen that he was the king's son Philip, and that he was planning to restore Antigonid rule over Macedon. Andriscos travelled to Macedon, but failed to garner any support, as the local nobles were happy with Roman rule. He then attempted to get the assistance of the Seleucid ruler Demetrius I, but the latter had his internal problems and didn't want to anger the Romans, so the pretender was sent into Roman custody. The Senate didn't consider Andriscos to be dangerous, so he was sent to Magna Graecia to live in custody, but managed to run away and ended up in Miletus. He once again started looking for supporters and gained them among the anti-Roman locals. Andriscos then travelled to Thrace, where the local chiefs, worried about strengthening Roman influence, supported him, giving him a small army. We don't know all the details, but in early 149 BC, the pretender entered Macedon. The nobles attempted to gather a force to stop him, but their armies were defeated somewhere in Odamantike. Thus Andriscos became the king as Philip VI and restored the Macedonian monarchy. Pro-Roman nobles lost their standing, while the general population celebrated their independence. The Fourth Macedonian War had begun. In the same year, he invaded the Roman-allied Thessalian League. The timing was perfect, as the best generals of the Republic were busy besieging Carthage during the Third Punic War and fighting in the Lusitanian War in Spain. The Roman commander in the area, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica, marched for Thessaly and started negotiating with Andriscos, hoping to buy time for his Achaean allies and the nearby Pergamene garrisons to join him. Indeed, the general was reinforced by these allies and even won legion from Italy. This was a signal to Andriscos that his enemies were getting stronger, so he attacked and crushed the allies, taking over most of Thessaly. Inspired, Andriscos sent envoys to Carthage, offering the revival of the old alliance. The winter stopped the hostilities, but the Romans were, as usual, full of energy. A veteran of the Third Macedonian War, Praetor Quintus Caecilius Metellus, was ordered to form another army, and in early 148 his legions embarked on Pergamene transports. In the past, the Roman armies landed in Epirus and then moved into the Greek heartland from there, but Metellus decided to outsmart his opponent and made landfall in Macedon, making his way south. This threatened Andriscos' kingdom and forced him to double time towards the enemy. The two sides met at the same place the fate of the Third Macedonian War was sealed 20 years ago, Pydna. Unfortunately, we don't know much about the battle, and even the number of combatants is a mystery. The battle started when the cavalry vanguards of the two armies met each other, and the Macedonian horsemen had the upper hand, sending their counterparts fleeing. Emboldened by that, Andriscos sent some of his troops back to Thessaly in order to continue the conquest. Soon the main bodies of the armies were close, and the infantry clashed in the center. Once again, the details are lost to time, and it is unknown if the Macedonians fought in their traditional phalanx. But initially the two groups of footmen fought to a standstill, and it seems that the battle would come down to a battle between horsemen. That is when Andriscos was betrayed by the commander of the cavalry, a nobleman named Telistos. The Macedonian center was attacked from all sides and was almost completely crushed. After the battle, Andriscos attempted to flee to Thrace, but his allies didn't want to draw the ire of the victors even more. Andriscos was captured and given to the Romans, who sent him to Italy, where he was executed. This was the end of the Fourth Macedonian War. This time, Macedon didn't even get a semblance of independence. Commanded by the Senate, Metellus turned Macedon, Epirus, southern Illyria, and the Ionian Islands into the province of Macedonia and became its first governor. However, the situation was getting volatile elsewhere in Greece. Sparta, now led by Menalcidas, had been trying to break away from the Achaean League for some time. In 147 BC, their delegation went to Rome to ask the Senate for assistance, but before the Romans were able to respond, Spartan territory was invaded by the strategos of the League, Democritus. Menalcidas was defeated, but the Achaeans failed to take the city itself. For that, Democritus was deposed and replaced by the even more extreme Diaeus. That is when a Roman embassy arrived to meet with the Achaean assembly. Unexpectedly for the Achaeans, the embassy not only supported Sparta's independence, but also demanded Argos, Corinth, and Orchomenus, possibly to spark a conflict. The Achaeans obviously refused, and sent their own embassy to Rome, demanding the resolution be rescinded. The Senate said no. It was clear that the Achaean League and other Greeks were angry at the Roman takeover of Macedon and Epirus, so joined by the Boeotians and Euboeans, in 146 BC, they declared war on the Roman Republic, starting the Achaean War. Another anti-Roman strategos, Critolaus, was elected, and his army, supported by the Thebans, marched for Thessaly. However, before they were able to reach Thermopylae, the Roman army under Metellus caught them at a place called Scarpheia in Locris. The Greeks didn't expect a battle. Their army was crushed and the general killed. Afterwards, the Roman governor continued south. The Argives attempted to stop his advance in Chaeronea, but were crushed. Diaeus took over command in Achaea, and in a short time managed to create a 16,000-strong army, hoping to defend at the Isthmus of Corinth. Unfortunately for him, the Roman army was reinforced by the consul Lucius Mummius, as well as a Pergamene detachment, bringing its numbers to 27,000. The two sides met at a place called Leucopetra. Once again, we don't have much in terms of details. Apparently the Romans didn't want to charge across the narrow isthmus, even despite outnumbering the enemy 2-1. For some time, the Roman army remained in the camp, and it seems that they got complacent, as Diaeus was able to use his light infantry to attack the camp and inflict heavy casualties. The next day, the Romans marched directly towards the enemy, and as they